On that cold November night, Washington, D.C. seemed enveloped in an eerie silence. The streets were sparsely populated, illuminated by streetlights reflecting off the damp sidewalks. Camille Hargrove strolled calmly, her mind still processing the exhausting debates that had consumed her day. At 52, Camille was the epitome of sophistication and resilience. Her dark skin, well-kept hair, and striking features carried the weight of countless battles and triumphs. From her upbringing in underprivileged neighborhoods to her position as a Supreme Court justice, her life was a testament to strength and determination. Despite her status, Camille was all too familiar with the risks of being a black woman in America. Racism wasn't an abstract concept to her. It was a daily reality. It lingered in suspicious glances, veiled comments, and sometimes outright threats. Even in the corridors of power, she encountered invisible barriers. The constant doubt of colleagues who perceived her presence as a token of affirmative action rather than undeniable merit. Dressed elegantly yet modestly in a black coat and a wool scarf, Camille had chosen to walk that evening. It was her way of reclaiming a slice of normalcy, a simple gesture that brought her comfort amidst the pressures of her role. Not far away, Officer Darren Crowe was on his usual patrol. Darren, a white man in his 40s, was infamous in the precinct for his tough-on-crime approach, a euphemism for violent and racially biased behavior. Over his 15 years in the force, he had amassed dozens of complaints for excessive force and racial discrimination. Yet, in a system that rarely held him accountable, Darren continued to patrol the streets as though untouchable. He justified his actions as being realistic, but the truth was that Darren viewed the world through a lens warped by racism and paranoia. To him, young black men were always suspects, black women were always defiant, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of respectability was a threat. As Camille walked down the street, adjusting her scarf against the biting wind, a teenager bolted out of a convenience store, his arms full of stolen snacks and sodas. The store clerk followed moments later, yelling in vain for the boy to stop. Camille, passing by at the time, glanced briefly at the commotion, but didn't linger. It wasn't in her nature to interfere without context. Darren, turning the corner in his squad car, saw only a black woman standing near the store. He didn't bother to observe the details. In his mind, the situation was already decided. "Ma'am, stop right there," he shouted as he exited the car, one hand resting on his holster. Camille turned slowly, surprised by the aggressive tone. "Can I help you, officer?" "Show me your hands now," he barked, closing the distance between them. Camille raised her hands, still unsure of the situation's severity. Her tone remained firm but polite. "I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I was just passing by." "Misunderstanding, huh? That's what they all say. Now empty your bag." Camille hesitated. It wasn't just the humiliation of the demand. It was the awareness of why he had targeted her. It wasn't because she looked guilty. It was because she was a black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, or rather, the wrong place in Darren's skewed perception. "With all due respect, I don't think that's necessary," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "You don't get to decide what's necessary," Darren snapped. "You chose to hang around here, and now you'll explain it downtown." Before Camille could respond, Darren grabbed her arm and forcefully turned her against the hood of his car. The cold metal pressed against her cheek contrasted sharply with the heat of her indignation. The handcuffs bit into her wrists as she drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "You have no idea who I am," Camille said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "Oh, sure, you're the most important person in the world, right?" Darren mocked, his tone dripping with disdain. In the minutes that followed, bystanders began to gather, some taking pictures and recording videos. Despite being handcuffed, Camille held her head high, her dignity unshaken by the public humiliation. Darren, on the other hand, seemed to revel in the power he wielded over the situation. "Let's go," he muttered as he placed her in the back seat of his car. "You can tell it to the judge tomorrow." What Darren didn't realize was that Camille wouldn't need a judge to be heard. She was the Supreme Court. Camille Hargrove was no stranger to the complexities of her identity. Born in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, she was the youngest of 4 children raised by a single mother who juggled 2 jobs to make ends meet. Her mother, Evelyn, had always stressed the importance of education, instilling in her children a fierce belief that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away. But even as Camille excelled in school, graduating as valedictorian and earning a full scholarship to Harvard, the weight of her skin color followed her everywhere. At Harvard, Camille quickly learned that brilliance wasn't enough to shield her from microaggressions or outright racism. Professors questioned her essay's originality, classmates assumed she was there because of affirmative action, and no matter how hard she worked, she felt the constant need to prove herself. These experiences shaped her resolve to dismantle the barriers that constrained people who looked like her. Her rise through the legal system was meteoric, yet fraught with challenges. As a young lawyer, she took on civil rights cases, fighting for people whose voices were silenced by systemic injustices. Later, as a judge, she became known for her fairness, intellect, and ability to see through the facades of those who tried to manipulate the system. But despite her achievements, Camille never allowed herself to forget her roots. That evening in Washington, she had been reflecting on an important case before the Supreme Court, one that addressed qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. The irony of her arrest was not lost on her. As she sat in the back of Darren's squad car, she couldn't help but think about how many other black men and women had been handcuffed in similar situations, their humanity disregarded simply because of their race. Meanwhile, Darren Crowe drove with a sense of smug satisfaction. To him, Camille was just another suspect caught red-handed, or so he believed. Darren's history painted a stark contrast to Camille's. He grew up in a predominantly white working-class neighborhood in Ohio, where diversity was seen more as a threat than an asset. His father, a factory worker, often spoke of keeping things in order, a sentiment Darren absorbed and later applied in his role as a police officer. Darren's early years on the force were marked by a series of incidents that, while minor on the surface, hinted at a deeply ingrained bias. He stopped and frisked black men at disproportionately high rates, justified by vague claims of suspicious behavior. When questioned by his superiors, Darren always had a ready excuse. He was just following protocol. The cracks in his record began to show after a high-profile case where a black teenager accused Darren of using excessive force during a routine stop. The boy's mother, a community activist, fought tirelessly for justice, but the case was quietly dismissed after Darren's union intervened. While his reputation among his colleagues remained intact, the black community in his district grew wary of him. As Darren drove to the precinct, Camille studied him through the rearview mirror. He exuded the confidence of someone who had never faced accountability. She recognized his type immediately, a man so steeped in privilege that he mistook it for merit. Her mind raced as she considered her next move. By the time they arrived at the precinct, word of the arrest had already spread. A young officer at the desk glanced nervously at Camille as Darren marched her inside. The officer recognized her immediately, not just as a Supreme Court justice, but as a symbol of justice itself. "Officer Crowe," the desk sergeant called out, his voice tinged with unease. "I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake," Darren replied brusquely. She was loitering near a theft scene, refused to cooperate. Typical. The sergeant's eyes darted back to Camille, his face paling as recognition set in. "Sir, I think you should take another look." Darren frowned but didn't move. Camille, still calm despite the weight of the cuffs, finally spoke. "Sergeant, I'd appreciate it if you checked my identification." Reluctantly, Darren fished through her bag and pulled out a slim black wallet. His eyes widened as he opened it, revealing an official government ID bearing Camille's name and title, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. For a moment, the room was silent. Darren's smug expression faltered, replaced by a mixture of confusion and panic. I didn't know," he began, but Camille interrupted him, her tone sharp yet composed. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask," she said. "You assumed." The sergeant quickly stepped in, ushering Darren aside and apologizing profusely. But Camille was unmoved by his words. The damage had already been done, not just to her, but to the countless others who had endured similar indignities without the power to fight back. As the situation unraveled, reporters who had caught wind of the arrest began gathering outside the precinct. Camille knew this moment would go far beyond her. It wasn't about her title or her influence. It was about exposing the rot within a system that allowed people like Darren to act without consequence. The sergeant uncuffed her personally, his hands shaking as he offered yet another apology. Camille stood tall, adjusting her coat and looking Darren directly in the eye. "I'll be addressing this," she said calmly, her words carrying the weight of inevitability. The morning after her arrest, Camille awoke to a barrage of missed calls and messages. The news had spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and social media. Supreme Court Justice wrongfully arrested in racial profiling incident. Clips of the arrest, recorded by onlookers, were already circulating online, sparking outrage and heated debates across the country. Camille sat at her kitchen table, sipping her tea while scrolling through the responses. There were messages of support from colleagues, civil rights organizations, and even members of Congress. But alongside them were vitriolic comments from anonymous profiles, accusing her of playing the race card or suggesting the arrest was justified. She closed her phone, her expression unreadable, but her resolve unwavering. Meanwhile, Darren Crowe's life was spiraling out of control. The video of him arresting Camille had gone viral, painting him as the embodiment of systemic racism. The precinct was inundated with calls demanding his suspension, and protesters gathered outside the building, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Justice" and "End Racial Profiling Now." Inside the station, Darren faced mounting pressure. His captain, a gruff man nearing retirement, called him into his office. "What were you thinking?" the captain barked, slamming a copy of the morning paper onto his desk. The headline read, "Racist Cop Arrests Supreme Court Justice." "I didn't know who she was," Darren muttered defensively. "That's the problem," the captain shot back. "You didn't know because you didn't care. This isn't the first complaint we've gotten about you, Crowe. But this is national news. It's not going away." Darren bristled but stayed silent. His mind raced with justifications, but deep down he knew this wasn't just about Camille Hargrove. His years of unchecked behavior were finally catching up to him. Camille, on the other hand, was already planning her next move. Later that morning, she met with her legal team, a group of sharp, diverse professionals who shared her commitment to justice. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her tone firm. "This is about holding the system accountable. Officer Crowe isn't an anomaly. He's a symptom of a much larger problem." One of her attorneys nodded. "The video makes it clear. We could push for a lawsuit against the city and the department, but if you're willing, this could be the cornerstone of a larger campaign for police reform." Camille leaned back, considering the weight of the decision. She had always believed in working within the system to create change, but this incident had made her question whether the system was truly capable of reform. As Camille strategized, Darren sought refuge in his suburban home. His wife, Lisa, was supportive, but visibly tense as they watched the news together. "This isn't who you are," Lisa said softly, though her words sounded more like a plea than a statement. "Isn't it?" Darren replied bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "The whole world thinks I'm some kind of monster. They don't care about the truth." Lisa hesitated before speaking. "Maybe it's time you took a hard look at what the truth is, Darren." Her words lingered, unsettling him in a way he wasn't ready to admit. Over the next few days, the national conversation intensified. News outlets replayed the video of Camille's arrest on a loop, with pundits debating its implications. Civil rights leaders used the incident to amplify calls for systemic change, while conservative commentators dismissed it as an overreaction. Camille, determined to keep the focus on the bigger picture, gave a powerful statement during a press conference. Standing on the steps of the Supreme Court, flanked by her attorneys, she addressed the nation. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "It is a reflection of the biases and failures embedded in our policing system. This isn't just about accountability for one officer. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure the same humiliation, fear, or injustice that I did." Her words reverberated across the country, galvanizing activists and sparking demonstrations in cities from New York to Los Angeles. For many, Camille had become a symbol of resilience and the fight for equality. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Darren was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but he knew his career was hanging by a thread. His colleagues, once indifferent to his behavior, now avoided him entirely, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. One evening, Darren received a knock at his door. It was a representative from the police union, offering legal support and a prepackaged narrative to defend his actions. "We'll say it was a misunderstanding," the rep suggested. "You were just doing your job and she happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Darren hesitated, the words ringing hollow even to him. For the first time, he questioned whether he wanted to defend the indefensible. Camille's campaign for change, meanwhile, gained momentum. Her legal team filed a federal lawsuit against the city, citing racial profiling and violations of constitutional rights. The lawsuit was more than a legal battle. It was a rallying cry for justice. As protests grew and public pressure mounted, the mayor of Washington, D.C., announced plans for a comprehensive review of police practices. Darren watched the announcement from his living room, his jaw tightening as the mayor condemned racial bias in law enforcement. For Darren, the walls were closing in. For Camille, the fight was just beginning. As Camille's lawsuit moved forward, her life became a whirlwind of media appearances, legal briefings, and public rallies. She was thrust into the role of a symbol, a role she accepted but didn't seek. Her days, once dominated by deliberations on constitutional law, were now punctuated by interviews with reporters and meetings with advocacy groups. One evening, Camille met with an old friend, Dr. Regina Thompson, a professor of African American Studies at Howard University. Over cups of tea in Camille's living room, they discussed the broader implications of her case. "Do you ever feel like they don't see you?" Regina asked. "All the time," Camille replied with a wry smile. "Even now, with the whole country watching, I'm not sure they're seeing me. They see what they want to see, a cause, a controversy, a story. But not me. That's the burden, isn't it?" Regina said. "You're not just fighting for yourself. You're carrying the weight of everyone who came before you and everyone who comes after." Camille nodded, her resolve strengthened. She knew the battle wasn't just hers. Meanwhile, Darren Crowe's life unraveled further. The department's internal investigation uncovered a troubling pattern. Years of complaints about racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct. Many of these complaints had been dismissed or quietly settled, but the public scrutiny surrounding Camille's case forced the department to re-examine them. Darren's lawyer, provided by the police union, advised him to avoid media appearances and let the union control the narrative. But Darren couldn't escape the growing backlash. Protesters gathered outside his home, shouting demands for justice. His wife, Lisa, became increasingly withdrawn, their once stable marriage now strained by the weight of public disgrace. One night, Lisa confronted Darren. "Do you even realize what you've done?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was doing my job," Darren snapped. "No, Darren, you were feeding your own biases," Lisa said, her tone sharp. "You didn't see her as a person. You saw her as a threat because that's what you've always done." Her words cut deep, forcing Darren to confront a truth he'd long avoided. While Darren grappled with his personal reckoning, Camille's case began to expose deeper systemic issues. During a press conference, her legal team revealed evidence of a pattern of racial profiling in the precinct where Darren worked. A data analyst, hired as part of Camille's lawsuit, presented statistics showing that black residents were 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched than their white counterparts. The revelations shocked the city. Activists demanded sweeping reforms, and the mayor announced the formation of an independent oversight committee to review police practices. The announcement was a small victory, but Camille knew it wasn't enough. Amid the growing tension, a new subplot emerged when one of Darren's former colleagues, Officer Maria Sanchez, decided to speak out. Maria had worked alongside Darren for years and had witnessed his discriminatory behavior firsthand. She described incidents where Darren had targeted black drivers without cause, ignored calls in predominantly black neighborhoods, and used derogatory language to describe suspects. Maria's testimony added fuel to the fire. Her decision to go public came at great personal risk. She faced backlash from the police union and ostracism from her peers, but she remained resolute. "It's time we stop protecting bad cops," Maria said during a televised interview. "People like Darren don't just damage the lives of those they target, they destroy trust in the entire system." Camille watched Maria's interview with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She admired Maria's bravery, but mourned the fact that it took such sacrifices to expose the truth. As the case gained momentum, Camille's legal team uncovered another layer of complexity. evidence that the police department had been suppressing complaints against Darren for years. Internal emails revealed that supervisors had dismissed complaints to avoid negative press and protect their own reputations. The revelations deepened the lawsuit's scope, turning it into a landmark case that challenged not just one officer, but an entire system. Camille found herself at the center of a national debate about policing, accountability, and race. At the same time, Darren found himself increasingly isolated. His wife left to stay with her sister, taking their young daughter with her. His lawyer advised him to accept a deal that would allow him to resign quietly in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. But Darren resisted, clinging to his belief that he was the victim. "You're not helping yourself," his lawyer warned. "I didn't do anything wrong," Darren replied, though his conviction wavered. The case took another dramatic turn when the Department of Justice announced it was launching a civil rights investigation into the precinct. For Camille, it was a step in the right direction, but she knew the fight was far from over. As the weeks passed, the lawsuit became a national symbol of the broader struggle for justice. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with demonstrators carrying signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." Celebrities and public figures voiced their support for Camille, amplifying her message and bringing even greater attention to the case. In the midst of the chaos, Camille received a surprising letter. It was from the teenage boy who had stolen from the convenience store the night of her arrest. He wrote to apologize for inadvertently involving her in the situation and thanked her for fighting back. "You could have just walked away," the letter read. "But because you're standing up, people like me might actually have a chance." The letter brought tears to Camille's eyes. It was a reminder of why she fought, of the lives that could be changed by her actions. As the trial date approached, the stakes grew higher. Camille and her team prepared to present their case, knowing it would be a defining moment not just for her, but for the entire nation. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the first day of the trial. Camille sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her legal team, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions beneath. Across the room, Darren Crowe sat beside his lawyer, his face a mask of defiance. Outside the courthouse, a sea of protesters gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice. The proceedings began with opening statements. Camille's lead attorney delivered a powerful argument, detailing how the arrest was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of racial profiling and misconduct within the precinct. Darren's lawyer countered by framing the arrest as a misunderstanding, claiming Darren acted in good faith under the circumstances. As the trial progressed, the testimony was damning. Maria Sanchez took the stand, recounting years of Darren's discriminatory behavior. The courtroom fell silent as she described incidents where Darren had deliberately targeted black residents and manipulated reports to justify his actions. "I reported it to my supervisors," Maria said, her voice steady. "But nothing ever changed. The department protected him just like they've protected others like him." Her words were a blow to Darren's defense, but the turning point came when the prosecution introduced a piece of evidence no one had anticipated: body camera footage from Darren's patrol car. The footage had been withheld by the precinct during the initial investigation, but Camille's legal team had fought to have it released. Now, it played on the courtroom's large screen, exposing Darren's actions in vivid detail. The video showed Darren arriving at the convenience store, ignoring the fleeing teenager, and focusing on Camille without cause. His tone was aggressive from the start, and his comments, laced with bias, were impossible to ignore. "She thinks she's above it all," Darren muttered to himself in the footage as he approached Camille. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Darren's lawyer seemed momentarily stunned. Camille remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her heart raced as the truth played out before everyone's eyes. When the video ended, the judge's stern gaze fell on Darren. His lawyer requested a recess, but the damage was done. The footage had not only undermined Darren's defense but also exposed the systemic failures of the precinct that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets replayed the footage on a loop, and the court of public opinion turned decisively against Darren. Protests swelled in size, with crowds demanding his conviction and broader reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. Darren, for the first time, seemed to realize the magnitude of his actions. In a private meeting with his lawyer, he finally admitted, "I didn't handle it right. I should have stopped and thought instead of assuming." His lawyer sighed. "It's too late for that now. The evidence speaks louder than your regret." Meanwhile, Camille faced a different kind of reckoning. The trial had brought her a level of visibility she never sought, and while many praised her courage, others criticized her, accusing her of using her position to push an agenda. She received threatening letters, and security around her had to be increased. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Camille returned home to find an envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "You're tearing this country apart. Stop now, or we'll stop you." Her hands trembled as she set the note down, but she refused to let fear deter her. She reported the threat to authorities and tightened her security measures, but the incident left her shaken. Despite the personal risks, Camille's resolve only grew stronger. She recognized that this case wasn't just about her. It was about every Black person who had ever been unjustly targeted, every individual who had suffered in silence because they lacked the platform to fight back. The trial took another dramatic turn when the Department of Justice announced it would formally investigate the entire precinct for civil rights violations. The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the city. For Camille, it was a bittersweet moment. The spotlight on the precinct's corruption was long overdue, but she knew the fight for accountability was far from over. Darren, under mounting pressure, decided to take the stand. His lawyer advised against it, but Darren insisted. As he sat in the witness chair, his usually confident demeanor faltered. "I didn't set out to hurt anyone," Darren began, his voice low. "But I see now that my actions weren't just mistakes. They were part of a pattern I didn't want to acknowledge. I let my biases guide me, and for that, I'm sorry." His admission shocked the courtroom. It wasn't a full reckoning, but it was more than anyone expected. For Camille, it was a small but significant step toward justice. The trial concluded with closing arguments, and the jury began deliberations. The nation waited with bated breath for the verdict, knowing the outcome would have far-reaching implications. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 tense days, during which public anticipation reached a fever pitch. Every news channel speculated about the outcome, pundits debated the implications, and the protests outside the courthouse swelled. Signs bearing phrases like "Justice for Camille" and "Systemic Reform Now" were carried by diverse crowds demanding accountability. Inside her home, Camille tried to maintain her usual calm. She spent the days reading legal briefs, preparing for upcoming cases, and occasionally staring out the window at the sea of reporters camped outside. Her sister, Deborah, visited often, offering comfort and distractions. "They'll see the truth," Deborah said one afternoon, pouring them both cups of coffee. "They'll see what they want to see," Camille replied, a faint smile on her lips. "But the truth is already out there. What matters now is what they decide to do with it." Darren Crowe, meanwhile, was confined to his home, suspended without pay and under intense public scrutiny. His wife Lisa hadn't returned, and his neighborhood was a target for demonstrators demanding his resignation and criminal charges. He spent hours glued to the television, watching his reputation crumble. For the first time in his life, Darren felt powerless. The department that had once shielded him now distanced itself. His colleagues no longer took his calls, and his lawyer's advice grew more curt by the day. The bravado he once wore like armor had shattered, leaving him to confront the wreckage of his choices. When the jury finally delivered its verdict, it sent shockwaves through the nation. The court found Darren guilty of civil rights violations and upheld Camille's claim of wrongful arrest. The jury also held the precinct partially accountable, citing systemic issues that allowed officers like Darren to act with impunity. Camille's legal victory was hailed as a turning point, a moment when the system was forced to reckon with its own failures. News anchors called it a watershed moment for justice, and civil rights organizations praised Camille's bravery and perseverance. But the consequences extended far beyond Darren and Camille. The verdict sparked a cascade of changes. The Department of Justice launched a formal investigation into the precinct, uncovering years of misconduct and corruption. Several officers were placed on administrative leave, including Darren's former supervisor, who had dismissed numerous complaints against him. The mayor announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training for officers, increased transparency in handling complaints, and the creation of a civilian oversight board. For many, These changes were a step in the right direction, but Camille remained cautious. "These reforms are necessary," she said during a televised interview, "but they are just the beginning. True justice requires a cultural shift, not just policy changes." Despite the victory, Camille's life would never return to its previous rhythm. Her prominence in the case made her a national figure, and with that came both admiration and backlash. She continued to receive threats, some more credible than others. Security followed her everywhere, a constant reminder of the risks she faced. One night, while preparing for bed, Camille paused to reflect. She pulled out the letter from the teenage boy who had sparked the chain of events. His words stayed with her. "Because you're standing up, people like me might actually have a chance." For Darren, the aftermath was bleak. His guilty verdict resulted in his termination from the force and the loss of his pension. Facing mounting legal fees and public scorn, he sold his house and moved to a small apartment in an unfamiliar part of town. The quiet of his new life was suffocating, forcing him to confront truths he had spent years ignoring. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Darren wrote a letter to Camille. "I know an apology doesn't change what I did, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I finally understand the harm I've caused. You didn't deserve what I did to you, and neither did anyone else I've hurt. I hope one day I can do something to make amends." Camille read the letter and folded it neatly, placing it in a drawer. She didn't respond, unsure if his words were genuine or another attempt to absolve himself. But she appreciated that for once, Darren seemed willing to take accountability. The public response to the verdict continued to ripple through society. Demonstrations across the country demanded similar investigations into other precincts. Social media buzzed with stories of individuals coming forward to share their experiences with racial profiling and police misconduct. For many, Camille's case became a rallying cry. Organizations advocating for criminal justice reform used the momentum to push for broader changes, including revising qualified immunity laws and demilitarizing police forces. Camille, while continuing her work on the Supreme Court, became an outspoken advocate for these causes, lending her voice and influence to amplify the movement. Yet not everyone was satisfied. Conservative commentators decried the verdict as an overreach, accusing Camille of exploiting her position for personal gain. These criticisms didn't faze her. She had long since learned that progress rarely came without resistance. In the months that followed, Camille began visiting communities affected by police violence, listening to their stories and helping them navigate the legal system. These visits, though emotionally taxing, reminded her why she fought so hard. "Justice isn't a destination," she told a group of law students during a lecture. "It's a journey, and every step we take matters." Months after the verdict, Camille stood on the stage at a packed auditorium in Atlanta, her hometown. She was addressing a gathering of civil rights leaders, law students, and community organizers. The event, titled "Reclaiming Justice: A Conversation with Justice Camille Hargrove," marked her first public appearance since the lawsuit concluded. "I grew up not far from here," Camille began, her voice steady but warm. "Back then, I never imagined I'd become a Supreme Court justice. What I did imagine every day was surviving systems that were designed to keep people like me in the shadows, systems that told us we weren't enough. That survival, though, planted the seeds for something bigger, a belief that we could change those systems." The audience erupted into applause, but Camille raised a hand to quiet them. "What happened to me was not unique. What made it different was that I had a platform, one that many don't. The real work now is to ensure that justice is not a privilege, it's a right, for everyone." Camille's words resonated deeply, but they also reflected a personal evolution. The experience of being wrongfully arrested had shaken her, forcing her to confront vulnerabilities she had long buried. For years, she had relied on her position and intellect to shield her from the harshest realities of systemic racism. But her arrest proved that even her stature couldn't protect her from prejudice. In the months following the trial, Camille worked to turn her pain into purpose. She partnered with civil rights organizations to launch the Equal Justice Initiative, a national campaign focused on addressing racial disparities in policing and the criminal justice system. The initiative provided legal resources to marginalized communities, pushed for legislative reforms, and conducted educational programs to combat implicit bias. The work was grueling, but rewarding. During one visit to a community center in Chicago, Camille met a young black woman named Tamara, who had been wrongfully arrested for loitering outside her apartment building. "When I saw your story, I felt like maybe someone would finally see us," Tamara said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for fighting." Camille placed a comforting hand on Tamara's shoulder. "Your story matters. Keep telling it. That's how we build the change we need." While Camille found purpose in her advocacy, Darren Crowe grappled with the fallout from his actions. Living in near isolation, he spent his days reading, reflecting, and occasionally writing. One day, while walking through his new neighborhood, he passed a local community center. A sign outside read, "Discussion on police reform, open to all." Curiosity, or perhaps guilt, drew him inside. The room was small, filled with a diverse group of residents sharing their experiences with law enforcement. Darren sat quietly in the back, listening as speaker after speaker recounted stories of humiliation, fear, and anger. "I never trusted the police," one man said. "Not because I wanted to, but because they never gave me a reason to." Those words stayed with Darren long after the meeting ended. For the first time, he saw himself not as a victim of public backlash, but as a participant in a broken system. Darren began attending the meetings regularly, though he never spoke. Over time, he built the courage to approach the center's director, a former social worker named Elijah, who had noticed Darren's presence. "You've been coming here for weeks," Elijah said, his tone measured. "What are you looking for?" "I want to understand," Darren replied hesitantly. "I know I've done harm, and I want to figure out how to fix it." Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding. "Understanding is a start, but fixing it? That takes work." Under Elijah's mentorship, Darren began volunteering at the center, organizing resources for residents and attending workshops on bias and community building. The process was humbling, forcing Darren to confront the harm he had caused and the systems he had upheld. At one meeting, Darren finally shared his story. "I was the cop people feared," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "I thought I was doing my job, but I wasn't serving anyone. I was serving my own ignorance. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to be better." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Darren didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped for understanding. As Darren worked to rebuild himself, Camille faced a new challenge. A colleague on the Supreme Court had privately expressed concern that her activism might compromise her impartiality. "Your work is important," they said during a chamber meeting, "but it's blurring the line between judge and advocate." Camille didn't flinch. "If advocating for justice makes my impartiality questionable, perhaps we need to redefine impartiality," she replied. Her statement sparked a thoughtful debate within the court, but Camille's resolve remained unshaken. She was determined to balance her judicial duties with her newfound advocacy, believing the two were not mutually exclusive. By the end of the year, Camille's Equal Justice Initiative had expanded to 20 cities, with plans for further growth. Darren, now a regular at the community center, worked quietly behind the scenes, helping organize events and fostering dialogue between residents and local police officers. Their paths, though vastly different, shared a common thread: growth. Camille had transformed her pain into a movement, while Darren had begun dismantling the biases that once defined him. Both had faced their demons and emerged with a clearer sense of purpose. A year after the trial, the ripple effects of Camille's arrest continued to shape the national conversation. The Equal Justice Initiative's influence had grown significantly, helping pass landmark legislation in several states. The new laws included stricter accountability for law enforcement, expanded civilian oversight, and funding for programs that address the root causes of systemic inequality. However, change did not come without resistance. Across the country, law enforcement unions mounted campaigns to undermine reform efforts, claiming they unfairly targeted officers. Conservative pundits accused Camille of being biased, using her position to push an agenda. Social media became a battleground, with heated debates about her role in the justice system. Despite the backlash, Camille remained focused. She had learned to filter out the noise, channeling her energy into the initiatives that mattered most. Yet, there was one development she couldn't ignore: a planned reconciliation forum in Washington, D.C., that would bring together law enforcement officials, community leaders, and activists to discuss the challenges of reform. The event, organized by the Equal Justice Initiative, was meant to foster dialogue, but its announcement had sparked controversy. Critics called it performative, while supporters lauded it as a crucial step toward unity. Camille was set to deliver the keynote address, and her presence alone drew intense scrutiny. On the morning of the forum, Camille prepared her speech with care, aware of the stakes. She chose her words deliberately, aiming to bridge divides without compromising her message. Meanwhile, Darren Crowe, now a year removed from his public disgrace, faced his own dilemma. Elijah, the community center director, had encouraged him to attend the forum and share his story as part of a panel discussion. "This isn't about saving face," Elijah had said. "It's about owning what you've done and showing people that change is possible." Darren hesitated. While he had made progress in understanding his biases and contributing to his community, he still wrestled with guilt and shame. Facing a crowd, especially one that might see him as a symbol of everything wrong with policing, felt like an impossible challenge. But on the day of the event, Darren decided to attend. Clad in plain clothes and sitting quietly in the back, he listened as community leaders shared their stories. Each one resonated with him, a painful reminder of the harm he had once caused. When Camille took the stage, the room fell silent. She began her speech with a simple but powerful statement. "I stand here today as a survivor of injustice, and as someone who has committed to dismantling it, brick by brick." Camille spoke about her arrest, the subsequent trial, and the broader implications for systemic change. But she also addressed the importance of dialogue, even with those who had perpetuated harm. "Accountability is non-negotiable," she said, her voice steady. "But accountability without understanding leads to cycles of division. If we want true justice, we must learn to confront our past while building a better future together." The audience erupted into applause, but one moment of her speech stood out to Darren. "Change begins with those willing to admit their faults and take the first step toward growth. It is not an easy path, but it is a necessary one." Those words stayed with Darren as he watched Camille leave the stage. He knew what he had to do. Later in the day, during a panel discussion, Darren finally raised his hand to speak. The moderator, surprised but curious, invited him to the front. "My name is Darren Crowe," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I was the officer who arrested Justice Hargrove." Gasps rippled through the room. Some attendees whispered, while others sat in stunned silence. Camille, seated in the audience, turned her gaze toward Darren, her expression unreadable. "For most of my career, I thought I was upholding the law," Darren continued. "But the truth is, I was upholding my own biases. I didn't see people, I saw threats, and I let those biases dictate my actions. Arresting Justice Hargrove was a wake-up call. It forced me to confront what I had ignored for years, the harm I caused, the trust I destroyed, and the system that allowed me to do it." Darren's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I know I can never undo the damage. But I want to be part of the solution now. I want to help rebuild the trust I spent years tearing down." The room was silent for a moment before a single voice began clapping. Slowly, others joined in, their applause hesitant but sincere. Camille watched Darren closely, searching for any sign of insincerity. She saw none. After the panel ended, Darren approached Camille. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if he should say anything. "Justice Hargrove," he began, his voice quiet. I'm sorry. For everything." Camille studied him for a moment before responding. "Apologies are a start, Officer Crowe, but change is a lifelong commitment." "I know," Darren replied, "and I'm willing to make it." Camille nodded, offering a faint but genuine smile. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, a step toward something better. The forum's closing session was held in a grand auditorium, packed with attendees eager to witness the final moments of the historic event. The stage was set for an open discussion, with Camille, Darren, and several other panelists representing law enforcement, activism, and community organizations. This was the first time Camille and Darren would share a stage, and the tension in the room was palpable. As the discussion began, the moderator introduced the topic, "Where do we go from here?" It was a question that demanded not just reflection, but action, and everyone in the room knew it. Camille spoke first, her words measured yet impassioned. "We must recognize that the path to justice is neither quick nor easy," she said. It requires systemic change, personal accountability, and most importantly, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Today is a step, but it is far from the last. The moderator turned to Darren, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Justice Hargrove is right," Darren said, his voice steady but subdued. "Change isn't easy. It took me far too long to realize how deeply ingrained my biases were, and it took an experience as public and painful as my arrest of Justice Hargrove to force me to see it. I've spent the past year trying to make sense of my actions, and while I know I can never undo the harm I caused, I've learned that acknowledging it is the only way forward." His admission drew murmurs from the audience. Some looked skeptical, others cautiously impressed. Camille listened intently, her expression unreadable as Darren continued. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Darren said, turning to Camille directly. "I'm here to ask for a chance to help fix what I've broken." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Camille. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze locked on Darren. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Crowe," she began, "acknowledging harm is important, but it is only the beginning. Accountability is not just about words. It's about actions. What actions have you taken?" Darren swallowed hard. He spoke about his time at the community center, his efforts to support local initiatives, and his growing role in organizing conversations between police officers and the communities they served. "I know it's not enough," Darren admitted, "but I'm committed to doing more, to being part of the solution instead of the problem." Camille studied him for a moment longer before responding. "Your journey is yours to walk. What matters most is whether you stay on the path." The audience broke into applause, though the moment was charged with complexity. Camille's words carried both acknowledgement and challenge, embodying the delicate balance between accountability and redemption. As the discussion continued, something unexpected happened. Audience members were invited to share their thoughts, and one by one they stepped up to the microphone. A young black man spoke about his fear of police encounters and how it shaped his daily life. An older white woman shared her frustration with the pace of reform and her desire to see faster, bolder action. A former police officer recounted his own struggles with bias and the importance of internal change within law enforcement. Darren and Camille listened intently, their presence lending weight to every voice. Each story was a reminder of the stakes, the struggles, and the shared humanity that underpinned the entire movement. But it was the final speaker, a teenage boy, who brought the room to its emotional peak. He approached the microphone with hesitant steps, clutching a piece of paper. "My name is Malik," he began, his voice trembling. "I'm the kid who ran out of that store the night Justice Hargrove was arrested." Gasps rippled through the audience. Camille's eyes widened slightly, her usually composed demeanor faltering for just a moment. "I didn't know who she was," Malik continued. "I just saw her get arrested and I ran because I was scared. Scared that if I stayed, it would have been me instead of her." Tears filled his eyes as he looked at Camille. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I'm sorry I ran. But because you stood up, people like me have a chance now. You showed me that we don't have to stay scared forever." The room fell silent as Camille rose from her seat and walked to Malik. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You don't need to apologize," she said softly. "Your fear wasn't unfounded, but your courage to speak today is what matters. Thank you for sharing your truth." The audience erupted into a standing ovation, the room filled with a powerful mix of hope and determination. As the event concluded, Camille and Darren found themselves face to face once more. Darren extended his hand hesitantly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Camille paused before shaking his hand. "Don't thank me, prove it. To them, to yourself." Darren nodded, understanding the weight of her words. In the weeks following the forum, the dialogue it sparked began to ripple across the nation. News outlets highlighted the event as a landmark moment, showcasing how an open conversation between those harmed and those responsible could lead to mutual understanding and concrete steps toward change. The Equal Justice Initiative received an outpouring of donations and offers of support, enabling them to expand their work into even more underserved communities. Camille's work didn't slow. Back in the chambers of the Supreme Court, She presided over a landmark case challenging the constitutionality of qualified immunity for law enforcement. The case, inspired in part by her own experience, sought to make it easier for victims of police misconduct to hold officers accountable. During oral arguments, Camille listened intently, her demeanor as impartial as ever, though her heart ached with the weight of what the decision could mean for countless lives. When the court ultimately ruled to narrow the scope of qualified immunity, it was hailed as a transformative victory for justice. Camille didn't celebrate publicly, but she allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. For Darren Crowe, life had taken on a different rhythm. He continued his volunteer work at the community center, now a quiet but steady presence in programs aimed at fostering better relationships between law enforcement and residents. His journey wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and confrontations with his past behavior. One day, Elijah pulled Darren aside after a particularly tense workshop. "You've come a long way," Elijah said, "but there's still more to do." "I know," Darren replied, "and I'll keep doing it. For as long as it takes." Word of Darren's transformation began to spread. He was invited to speak at police academies and training seminars, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a call for reform. While many were skeptical of his sincerity, Darren never wavered in his commitment to change. Camille and Darren's paths rarely crossed after the forum, but their stories remained intertwined in the public's mind. Both had become symbols of accountability and transformation, though their journeys had taken vastly different forms. Camille's focus shifted toward nurturing the next generation of leaders. She frequently visited universities, mentoring young law students, and encouraging them to approach the law not just as a set of rules, but as a tool for equity and empowerment. "Justice isn't static," she often said during her lectures. "It evolves with us, shaped by our choices and our courage to challenge the status quo." One particularly promising student, Tamara, whom Camille had met months earlier at the community center in Chicago, reached out to her with exciting news. She had been accepted into law school and wanted Camille to know how much her guidance had inspired her. "You showed me that we can change things," Tamara wrote in a heartfelt letter. "Not overnight and not without struggle, but step by step. Thank you for showing me what justice looks like." The letter reminded Camille of why she fought so hard. It wasn't about accolades or vindication. It was about the lives she could touch, the systems she could help reshape, and the legacy she could leave behind. As Camille stood in her office one evening, looking out at the Washington skyline, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The arrest, the trial, and the struggles that followed had tested her in ways she never anticipated, but they had also reaffirmed her belief in the power of resilience and the necessity of confronting injustice head-on. The scars of that night in handcuffs would never fully fade, but Camille no longer saw them as marks of shame. Instead, they were reminders of the work still to be done and the strength required to do it. For Darren, life would never return to what it once was, but he had found purpose in his redemption. The process of rebuilding trust with himself, with his community, and with those he had wronged was ongoing, but it was work he embraced wholeheartedly. And while they stood on opposite sides of a transformative moment, Camille and Darren's stories together illuminated an undeniable truth. That change, though difficult and imperfect, was possible when people confronted their own failings and chose to do better. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Camille Hargrove stood at the steps of a courthouse in Atlanta, surrounded by a group of law students. She was conducting a mentorship program, walking them through the realities of practicing law with integrity and purpose. Among the students was Tamara, now in her second year of law school. She listened intently as Camille spoke, her notebook filled with scribbled notes and ideas. "As future lawyers, you'll have the power to shape the world," Camille told them. "Never underestimate the impact of your choices, whether they're in a courtroom or a community center. Justice is built one case, one conversation, and one courageous act at a time." Later that evening, Camille sat in her office reviewing a brief for an upcoming Supreme Court case. On her desk sat a framed photograph from the Reconciliation Forum, a candid moment captured of her shaking Darren Crowe's hand. She didn't display it as a trophy, but as a reminder of the complexities of justice and the human capacity for growth. Darren, now a certified conflict resolution facilitator, was working at a police reform nonprofit. His days were spent bridging gaps between officers and communities, helping them navigate difficult conversations and rebuild trust. Though some still doubted his sincerity, he no longer let their skepticism deter him. One night, as he prepared for a workshop, Darren received an email from Elijah. Attached was a video clip of a young officer addressing a community forum. "She said you inspired her," Elijah wrote. Watching the clip, Darren recognized the officer as someone he had mentored during a training session. She spoke passionately about changing the culture of policing and the importance of accountability. For the first time in years, Darren felt a glimmer of hope that his work was making a difference. Far from Washington and Darren's nonprofit, the impact of Camille's case continued to ripple outward. New legislation, inspired by the Equal Justice Initiative, was being debated in Congress, aiming to create a national database of police misconduct and enforce stricter federal oversight of local departments. The night the bill passed the Senate, Camille watched the news with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The work wasn't finished, but it was progress, the kind she had always dreamed of achieving. As she turned off the television, her phone buzzed with a text from Tamara. "Thank you for everything. One day, I hope to be in your shoes." Camille smiled and replied, "You won't be in my shoes. You'll create your own path, and it will be extraordinary." In the stillness of that moment, Camille reflected on how far she had come and the countless steps that lay ahead. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one she was determined to walk, no matter how long it took. This story is a reflection of the complex realities of justice, resilience, and redemption. Camille and Darren's journeys show us that real change requires courage. Courage to confront our biases, demand accountability, and create systems that serve everyone fairly. Camille's strength reminds us that justice is not static. It evolves through our collective efforts to challenge inequality and fight for what's right. Darren's transformation highlights the possibility of redemption when we commit to growth and take responsibility for our actions. Their stories, though fictional, mirror struggles we see in the world around us every day. Now, it's your turn to keep the conversation alive. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and share it with others. Your engagement can help spread these powerful messages and inspire action in your community and beyond. Justice is not the work of a single individual. It's a collective journey. By sharing this story, you're contributing to that journey and helping us imagine a better, more equitable future. Together, we can take meaningful steps toward the justice we all deserve.